Hi students, welcome to lesson number 31, Peasant Movement in Modern India. A social movement is a mass movement and a collective attempt of people to bring about a change or to resist any change. Social movements possess a considerable measure of internal order and purposeful orientation, and this strengthens the movement to challenge the established institutions. Social movement arises when there emerges an issue or a set of issues that affect a significant proportion of people in some way or the other. Gradually, these issues start gaining importance and result in mass participation of people and in collective action. Peasant movements are among one of the most important social movements in India. Indian economy is primarily an agrarian economy. The main occupation of majority of the population being agriculture, it was primitive in nature. It is the land which constitutes the major source of livelihood for the village people, but all the peasants who live in the villages do not own their individual land. Feudal lords had complete domination over the lands and there was an unequal distribution. With the emergence of agricultural capitalism, the growth of green revolution and the spread of education along with the development of agriculture, unrest among peasants have increased. After independence, the government's agriculture policy evolved a two-pronged strategy. On one hand, there was a need to modernize agriculture and increase production, and on the other bring about a uniform ownership system. In early 1960s, new agricultural policies were introduced popularly under the banner of Green Revolution, primarily to increase production. The policies were designed to provide financial support to the landowners and in turn increase their output by assuring access to all irrigational facilities. Only the rich and middle class farmers who could secure loans, invest in fertilizers and procure high yield variety seeds, as the agriculture policies did not touch upon redistribution of the agriculture produce, the condition of small and marginal farmers deteriorated drastically. The history of peasant movements can be traced to the economic policies of the Britishers, which have brought about many changes in the Indian agrarian system. Who is called a peasant? People who depend on agriculture are differentiated in terms of their relationship with the land, such as owners of the land, absentee landlords, supervisory agriculturalists, owner cultivators, sharecroppers, tenants and landless labourers. In local language, they are known as kisans. The word kisan is often translated as peasant. In the academic literature, the word peasant is used to refer to the agriculturalists who are the owners of small holding and carry on their agricultural work with the help of family labor, and it includes those who depend on land for their livelihood, such as the supervisory agriculturalists and landless labourers. According to Jan Bremen, a peasant is one who tills the land. Thus, for the convenience, a peasant is one who generates income out of the land owned by him. According to Gove, peasants are people who engage in agriculture or related production with primitive means and who surrender part of their produce to landlords or to agents of state. From this definition, the position of the peasant is clear. They who are subservient to the landlords. A peasant movement is defined as a relatively organized and continuous collective action involving violence or the threat of violence for securing more share in the control or ownership of land and its produce, and to abolish injustices which have arisen thereof. Types of peasants. Indian peasantry, as elsewhere, is not a homogeneous category. There are different types of peasant and the criteria taken for the heterogeneity of peasantry are also varied. Some rural sociologists have taken the ownership of land for peasant categorization. Some others have taken assets besides agricultural land ownership as the criteria for peasant categorization. However, the categorization varies from one empirical situation to another. One of the modest categorization of the peasants is given below. On the basis of land ownership, Daniel Thorner has taken land ownership as the basis for classifying the peasant. The peasants who have the documents of the land ownership in their name are the maliks. Those who do not own the land ownership document patta but cultivate the land are the kisans, and the tillers of the land, the mazdoor, who earn their livelihood by working in the field of as agricultural laborers. On the basis of size of the land holdings, some state governments have classified the types of peasants on the basis of the size of their land holdings. Accordingly, the classification is as follows: rich peasant, peasants who own more than 15 acres of land; small peasants, peasants who possess land between the size of 2.5 and 5 acres; of marginal farmers, farmers who own land which is less than 2.5 acres. Landless peasants, these peasants earn their livelihood by working as manual laborers in agricultural lands of others as they do not possess any land. They work as sharecroppers and subtenants. Class-based classification of peasants. According to Utsa Patnaik, class differentiation exists within peasantry. Growth of capitalism in rural peasantry has resulted in the exploitation of peasantry that has taken a class character. There are two categories of peasants: one, the big landlords, and the second, the agricultural laborers, who also include the sharecroppers. Peasant classification on the basis of resource ownership. Some sociologists have categorized the peasants on the basis of several other resources such as utilization of the loans, tenancy, ownership of assets, credit from bank, and repayment capacity of loans. There are 5 types of peasant groups according to K. L. Sharma: owner cultivator, largely owner cultivator, largely tenant cultivator, tenant cultivator, totally poor peasant. Due to the variety of criteria used for categorization of peasants, there is no uniform typology of peasants. In addition to this criteria used by sociologists, economists also used certain criteria for peasant types. They classified the peasants into landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants, and agricultural peasants. Despite the diversity of criteria for peasant categorization, any classification of peasants, land tenancy, and land size play an important role. Thus, both these combined together play an important role in determining the criteria for peasant classification. The agrarian unrest. Indian peasantry has witnessed certain ups and downs in its history. The peaceful and quiet peasantry has been transformed into an agitating peasantry. Peasants today are up in arms rightly observed by A.R. Desai. The history of peasant unrest goes back to first quarter of 1920s. A.R. Desai calls the unrest as the peasant struggle. Kathleen Gow calls it as peasant uprising. D.N. Dhanagare reviews the peasant agitation as a peasant movement. In the post-independent India, there has come a revolution in agriculture. It has increased the farm produce. The subsistence farm produce has become a surplus produce for the market. The agriculture has become capitalistic. Within the transformation in agriculture, the situation of peasants has also undergone change. This change has given rise to many problems. The peasants have demands. The relations between peasants and agricultural laborers have also undergone change. By considering the above said factors, we can understand the peasant movement in India. Peasant movements are among one of the most important social movements in India. The political behavior of the peasantry is mostly based on the factions, which are the integrated segments of the rural society. The rural society is dominated by the landlords and the rich peasants at the top and the landless and poor peasants at the bottom of the social hierarchy. There is no unity or solidarity among the exploited sections of the peasantry, as they were divided among themselves due to their allegiance to the factions and are led by their masters. In rural areas, the land reforms and agricultural policies are not properly implemented. Land reforms benefited the small and marginal farmers, but not the landless. Further, the mechanization and commercialization and state-sponsored rural development programs benefited the rich and middle-class peasants. Consequently, the number of landless agricultural laborers was unemployed increased at this juncture. The rural poor realized the need for a collective action in order to fight against injustice and also against the state that does not protect their rights. Peasants demand higher wages and better working conditions. These movements were organized by the Kisan Sabhas and the agricultural units of communist parties. The main purpose of all these movements is to strive to improve the economic conditions of all those who earn their livelihood toiling in agricultural fields and related work. Classification of peasant movements. In India, peasant movements are generally classified into pre-British, British or colonial and post-independence, according to Ghanshyam. According to women, there are certain movements which continue to despite the changes in the political power. These are the movements which started in the pre-independence era and are still continued, though with different goals. A.R. Desai classified the colonial India into the following areas under the British rule as Raitwari, the areas under the princely authority as Zamindari and tribal zones. He calls the movements as peasant struggles in the colonial period and those of post-independence, agrarian struggles in the colonial period and those of post-independence agrarian struggles into two categories: the movements launched by the newly emerging proprietary classes comprising rich farmers, viable sections of the middle peasant proprietors and the streamlined landlords, and second, the movements launched by various sections of the agrarian poor in which the agrarian proletariat have been acquiring central importance. There are various classifications given by different scholars depending upon the period and issues involved. Neither in the pre-independent nor post-independent India there ever existed a unified pattern of agrarian structure, though in post-independent India there was a centralized political authority and a capitalist mode of production acting as driving forces. There has not yet evolved a unified agrarian pattern. The classification also varies in accordance with the theoretical framework. Kathleen Gow classifies the peasant revolts into 5 categories. They are restorative rebellions to drive out the British and restore earlier rulers and social relations, religious movements for the liberation of a region or an ethnic group under a new form of government, social banditry, terrorist vengeance with the idea of meting out collective injustice, the mass insurrections for the redressal of particular grievances. Another classification of peasant movements, Pushpendra Surana, into 8 types based on issues such as the movements against forced cultivation of a particular type of crop, exploitation by money lenders, price rise, outside invaders and dynasties. Peasant movements in India. The history of agrarian unrest can be traced back to the first quarter of 1920s. Many rural sociologists have used various terms for peasant unrest. For some of the unrest is called as a peasant struggle, for some others it is peasant revolution. Whatever may be the term, the fact remains that the post-independent India has witnessed an important revolution in agriculture. This revolution has increased the farm produce. It has now become the surplus farm produce for the market. Thus, agriculture has become capitalistic in nature. The change in the agrarian situation has resulted in a change in the situation of the peasant, which has given rise to many problems. The peasant demands were more, which brought about changes in relations between peasants and agricultural laborers. Let us discuss some of the important peasant movements in India. Peasant movements in pre-independence India. Champaran Satyagraha 1917. The Champaran peasant movement was a part of the wider struggle for independence. Gandhiji made the experiment of non-cooperation by leading the Champaran, that is in Bihar and Kheda, Gujarat, peasant struggles after returning from South Africa. These struggles were taken up as a reformist movement, but the idea was to mobilize the peasants for their demands. The Champaran peasant movement was launched in 1917-18. The main objective was to create awakening among the peasantry against the European planters. These planters exploited the peasants without providing them adequate remuneration for their labor. The European planters resorted to all sorts of illegal and inhuman methods of indigo cultivation. The peasants were not only exploited by the European planters but also by the local zamindars. Gandhiji studied the grievances of the Champaran peasantry. The peasants opposed not only the European planters but also the zamindars. It was in such a situation that Gandhiji took up their cause and launched the movement. Some of the important causes of Champaran peasant struggle are as follows. In Champaran, there was an enormous personal increase in the land rent. The peasants were compelled by the European planters to grow indigo, which curtailed their freedom of cultivation. The peasants were forced to devote their best part of land to cultivate crops according to the wishes of the landlord. The payment of wages was meagre to the peasants, which was not sufficient to earn their livelihood. The peasants of Champaran were living under miserable conditions and were suffering from abject poverty. The Champaran peasantry suffered a lot in the hands of European planters. landlords and government officials. Gandhi, who returned from South Africa at this time, wanted to practice his non-cooperation and satyagraha in India. The people of Champaran also accepted his leadership. Unfortunately, in the end, the movement turned violent due to the incidents of Chauri Chaura. Gandhi was very unhappy with this incident. However, the Champaran struggle is considered part of the national movement. The Champaran Satyagraha took place in April 1917 in order to oppress the peasant of Champaran. The British government adopted very serious methods. The peasants were tortured for not paying the excess rents. Thus, the peasants of Champaran had to undergo severe suffering and misery. However, the movement has led to certain important outcomes. The Champaran Agrarian Act was assented by the Governor General of India on 1st May 1918. The ideology of non-violence had given much strength to the peasants who participated in the movement. The movement also contributed to the growth of nationalism. The Champaran peasant movement is described to be a success story in the history of peasant movements in India. There were few scholars who did not consider Champaran movement as a success story. The movement did not succeed to strike against the exploitation and discrimination with which the peasants suffered. The settlement made between the government and the peasants did not embrace the exploitation of our peasants by zamindars, and also this agitation did not lead up to any fight against the main causes for the terrible poverty and sufferings of Champaran peasants. The excessive rents and exorbitant incidence of debts. Kheda Peasant Struggle 1918. The Kheda Peasant Struggle is also known as No Tax Peasant Struggle. It was a satyagraha launched in March 1919 under the leadership of Gandhiji, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and several others. The peasantry of Kheda consisted of patidars who were known for their skills in agriculture. The patidars were well educated. Kheda is situated in the central part of Gujarat and was fertile for the cultivation of tobacco and cotton crops. Some of the causes for the Kheda struggle were the government reassessed the Kheda land and the cultivated crops. On the basis of land data, the government increased the tax, which was not acceptable to the peasants. The peasants had suffered a famine and this had resulted in a large-scale failure of the crops. The government did not accept the failure of crops but was insisted on the collection of land tax. Not taking the conditions of peasants into consideration, the peasantry made their enquiries and emphasized that the act of demanding the land tax in such famine conditions was not justified on the part of the government. The Gujarat Sabha, consisting the peasants, submitted petitions to the higher authorities of the province requesting the suspension of the revenue assessment for the year 1919, but the officials rejected the demands of the peasants regarding the non-payment of the taxes. When the government refused to consider the demands of the peasants, Gandhiji encouraged the peasants to resort to satyagraha. Thus, the Kheda Satyagraha was started in March 1919 under the leadership of Gandhiji, Vallabhbhai Patel and others. The government officials auctioned the peasants' cattle, confiscated their houses and took away their movable property due to non-payment of the land tax. The peasants were issued notices of fines and penalties by the government. The movement was terminated owing to the acceptance of some of the prime demands of the peasantry. Some of the achievements of the struggle were as follows. It was decided that the rich patidars peasants will pay up the land rent and the poor peasants were granted remissions. Due to this decision, the small and poor peasants, who are the majority, were very satisfied. The movement also created an awakening among the peasants about their demands. The peasants also indirectly sought their participation in the independence struggle. The impact of success was also recognized among the peasants of Gujarat and in neighboring states. Peasant movements at the eve of independence. Telangana peasant struggle. This movement was started against the Nizam of Hyderabad. The agrarian social structure in the Nizam's Hyderabad was of a feudal order. It has two kinds of land tenure systems, namely Raitwari and Jagirdari. Under the Raitwari system, the peasants owned patta and were proprietors of the land. They were registered occupants. The actual cultivators of the land were known as Shikmidas. The Khalsa lands were chieftains' lands. The Deshmukhs and Deshpandes were the hereditary tax collectors for the Khalsa villages. The Jagirdars collected the tax in the Jagir villages. The Jagirdars and Deshmukhs exercised immense power at the local level. The main commercial crops of the Telangana region were groundnut, tobacco and castor seeds, which were cultivated by the land-owning Brahmins. The rise of Reddis and other peasant proprietors strengthened the higher caste. The urban groups, Marwaris and Muslims and Vaishyas showed in gaining and acquiring the lands. This resulted in sliding down the status of the peasant proprietors to that of tenants at will, sharecroppers and landless labourers. Some of the main causes for the rise of the Telangana movement are as follows. The Jagirdars and the Deshmukhs were the intermediaries and were responsible for collecting taxes from the cultivators. The cultivators were oppressed and exploited by these intermediaries who were appointed by the Nizam. They collected high taxes, manipulated the records, which resulted in the discontentment among the poor peasants. The Deshmukhs were called as Dora, which means the master of the village. This exploitation was legitimized and was known as Vetti system. Under this system, the landlord could force a family to cultivate his land, assign domestic or official works, which was obligatory on the part of the peasant's family and was carried on from generation to generation. A system of slavery known as Baghela was prevalent in the state of Nizams. Under this system, the tenants who have taken the loans from the landlords had to serve the landlord until the debt is repaid. The landlords used to maintain the records, which always showed that the Baghelas are still indebted to them. The Telangana movement did not just erupt suddenly. There were many factors which resulted in such insurrection. The condition of peasants reached its saturation by 1930. There was a lot of discontentment among the peasantry and they were waiting for a right opportunity to burst out and start a rebellion. Some of the consequences and outcomes of the Telangana peasant struggle are: the Telangana peasant struggle had a participation of mixed class of peasantry. The major achievement of this peasant struggle was that it brought together tenants, the sharecroppers and landless labourers for the first time. The movement secured the strength of the poor peasants. The Communist Party, which exercised its power over the whole state of Hyderabad for a long time, benefited from this struggle. There were few gains for the peasants on the whole. It was a failure as far as the demands of the poor peasants classes are concerned. Summary: agriculture, which is the backbone of Indian economy, and the peasant who depend on agriculture is the main occupation for him. The history of peasant movement can be traced to the economic policies of the Britishers, which have brought about many changes in Indian agrarian system. The consequences of the British colonial expansion were felt the most by the Indian peasantry that rose in revolt from time to time. The peasant struggles in the contemporary India in different states are rooted in the process of modernization. India was a poor country and agriculture was primitive in nature. Further, feudal lords had complete domination over the lands and there was an unequal distribution.